So welcome to this afternoon session on innovation for impact. I would also like to welcome the online audience. And today we have a very exciting set of panelists for you. And you got a bonus. We got 4 panelists today. So before we begin, I want to open with acknowledgement to country. We're here on the lands of the Ngunnawal people in the Canberra region. And I just reflected today when I was doing a bit of research that they've been here for over 21 years. And there's actually a heritage trail around campus that starts from the Union Court, which is not too far from here. And the heritage trail takes you around the history, the Indigenous history of the campus and in parts of Canberra region. So if you are looking something to do after this conference and waiting for your flight, that's an option, and it seems very interesting when I looked into it. So to open up the session, we have with us today 4 speakers who will showcase innovative examples of social impact measurement and strategies promoting the benefits of volunteer involvement, and that includes change. Innovation is change, right? So first up on my right-hand side here, we have Simon Vaughn, and I'll tell you more about them as they stand up to do their presentations. From Huber Social, we have Kate Thiele from Meals on Wheels. We have Dannika White from B Collective, and we have Penny Aquino from the Salvation Army. Now, we are just waiting for the last set of people to settle in, and we want to say hello to, again, we want to engage with our online audience. So hello and a call out and a shout out to you as well. All right, we're settled. So first up, we have Kate Thiele, who is the National Executive Director for Meals on Wheels Australia. She's also a board chair, non-executive director, and principal of Clarity, where she supports for-purpose government and private organisations with a range of strategic environmental, social and governance advice. Next, we have Simon Vaughn, who is a measurement lead at Huber Social, where he runs social impact measurement projects across a range of sectors. Prior to this, he worked as a fundraiser in international development for over a decade across a broad array of areas, raising millions for organisations he worked for. We have Dannika White, who's the Director of Community B Collective. Dannika is an experienced leader who has specialised in implementing transformation and change within a number of industries. She currently works with charities, not-for-profits and community groups, helping them implement programs which attract, engage and retain volunteers. And finally, we have Penny, who has held volunteer management roles in World Vision, RSPCA, and currently holds a national role as General Manager, Volunteer Resources at the Salvos, equaling over 17 years in the sector. And last but not least, she recently completed a Master's in Leadership and Management Organisational Dynamics. So that's the stars for today. I should also introduce myself. My name is Thu-Trang. I recently had the privilege of being appointed the CEO of Volunteering Victoria. Before that, I was the CEO of Volunteer West, which is a regional volunteer resource centre out in Melbourne's West. And prior to that, most of my career was spent in public policy, working for the Victorian government across a range of portfolios, including the Australian consumer law, charities, not-for-profits, caravan parks, liquor, and I wear a few other hats as well, but I won't go into that. And most importantly, I'm very proud to be a volunteer from yay nay to now, where I'm a volunteer director of Good Shepherd Australia and New Zealand. So before we launch into the presentations, I have to note some housekeeping for you. So, and now we throw to Simon and Kate.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. It's amazing to have such a full room, and to everyone online and to all of you standing around the edge. Good job, nice work. It's my absolute pleasure to talk about Meals on Wheels today, a phenomenal organisation founded in a little community at Port Adelaide in South Australia, which is 70 years old this year. And today we're going to talk a little bit about how we've gone around measuring social impact, and I'll touch on Meals on Wheels briefly and then hand over to Simon to talk about the actual process of measuring social impact. And I'll talk a little bit about the problem, and then we'll talk about how we actually work through finding a solution. So that's the conversation for today. I imagine most of you know Meals on Wheels, but let me tell you a little bit more about it. Meals on Wheels has 45,000 volunteers. It was up to around 70,000. Over time it's declined, but at the moment around 45,000 volunteers. We represent, Meals on Wheels Australia represents over 590 service outlets across our beautiful country, which means we actually have more outlets than there are post offices in Australia, or Bunnings, or Mitre 10. In fact, our workforce is larger than Telstra, so it's quite incredible, and principally volunteer based. We do have some paid staff. We have about 1,000 paid staff across the country, but 45,000 volleys. I've put up the top the very first comment that Meals on Wheels is really part of the Australian lexicon, and probably because its brand awareness is so high. For those of you who understand brand, it has 98% unprompted brand awareness. 98, it's incredible. And many of you, can I ask you, pop your hands up, have you had a family member who's had Meals on Wheels, or a grandma, or someone recipient? Yeah, look at that, it's just beautiful. So it's something that we relate to quite comfortably. We kind of get a sense that it's around delivering meals, and have a connectivity to what it is. Ironically, the mission is slightly different than just delivering meals. The mission of Meals on Wheels Australia is actually about providing independence, safety and well-being, particularly for people living in community. So whilst the majority, very much the majority of the people we support are older, we also support people living with disability and people in the community who are disadvantaged. That part is probably not as well known. So we navigate the Commonwealth Home Support Program, we navigate NDIS, and indeed we use fundraising to try and raise funds for people who are disadvantaged. So that's just a touch of who we are, and I'm happy to expand on that when we get to the end if any of you want to ask me any questions about the organisation. So the need to, the need to measure social impact. Like many organisations, we've grown from a grassroots environment. You know, it's not about a national body working through a hub and spoke methodology. It's absolutely decentralised. So it doesn't matter whether you're at the top of Australia or the bottom of Australia and you're supporting communities there. You have real autonomy at your local level, and that's modelled together in different ways depending which state you're in. And what we didn't know nationally what that core part of our mission really meant. We couldn't or hadn't measured our social contribution to older people. And yet we know for people living in the community, social isolation is a massive risk for them. We know that their well-being goes down when they're isolated. We know for older people, 1 in 4 are at risk of malnutrition. And in fact, many are living with malnutrition. There is a myth for older people that as you get older, losing weight is a good thing, and that we think, you know, if you're the slimmer you are when you get older, the longer you'll live. It's actually not true. The more protein, the more muscle development that you have on your body as you age, the better that your longevity will be. So we didn't understand necessarily this social connection piece. We didn't know how we were making a difference on a macro level. And as you all know, that is so critically important today, because we've got to demonstrate that to a range of stakeholders, not just funders, but to people who are passionate about what we want to do, to potential volunteers, to ourselves to validate the work that we're doing, to know what is best practice and how to share that, to understand what outcomes are and not outputs, and to really appreciate how that connectivity works between someone volunteering who's often over 70 and someone receiving a meal who's often over 80. In fact, we have some of our volunteers who are 95 providing meals to people in the homes who are in their 70s. So there's stories like that everywhere. I could spend the whole hour just telling you beautiful stories. Ultimately, what it is we know that we do inherent good work in the community, but we needed to be able to validate that better. We wanted the opportunity to build best practice, and we wanted to balance out our amazing ability to do storytelling with evidence and data. And that's not a unique problem. All of us who work in this space are challenged with that right now. It's something that we're all trying to master and get better at. The joy for us is that we found this fantastic organisation who is based in Sydney called Huber, who doesn't worry about measuring the financial contribution of volunteering as much as the inherent contribution of volunteering. And that's really important because often, volunteers are mentioned in hours, and that's translated to a monetary value in terms of in kind. Well, that's just a metric. It doesn't really talk much about outcomes. So I'm going to hand over to Simon and let him share with you some of the work that we did with Huber and how we actually got better at understanding outcomes and what some of them were. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Got to go this way. All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Simon Vaughn. I work for Huber Social. We are a social impact measurement agency. So what that means is that we help organisations, like many in this room, anyone that works with people, we help them to measure the effectiveness of what they're doing if they're trying to have an impact on people. Often people are coming to us as Meals on Wheels are because they see the change with their own eyes every day. But when they go to have conversations about that change that they're seeing, those stories aren't necessarily what the funders and other people want to hear. They want to see a graph. And so we help to give people a graph that can sit behind those stories, as well as other forms of data. Literally we were told point here, not there, and I'm already just, anyway. So we're recognised locally and globally for our integrity. We work across the world. Our clients come from across the public, private and social sectors. And so we've been doing this for a while now. And we have an approach to measuring social impact, which is based around the core concept of well-being. Because essentially the founders of Huber, when they came to figure out how to do social impact measurement, they chatted to a lot of different organisations, lots of different sectors, and figured out at the core of everyone that is trying to make a change in the lives of people, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is help them to live a better life. And so then the question was, what is a measure of that central idea of wanting to live a better life, wanting to be able to fulfil our potential and live a life that we individually value? And that's where they settled on well-being. We measure this idea of well-being through a globally recognised satisfaction with life scale that's been used in contexts across the world for the last 3 decades. And so that gives us our lighthouse measure to give us a sense of how things are going for the people that we're measuring and how an organisation is doing. Are they helping well-being go up? Are they helping keep it stable in an environment where we might expect it to decrease? Is well-being actually go down and we need to take action? But knowing how someone's doing overall, whilst important to give you a core measure, is not that useful if you don't know what is having an impact on that overall picture. So what's contributing to their well-being? And that's where on the next level, we look at what we call outcomes, capabilities and opportunities. So a capability is something that's internal to you, something I have the knowledge, for example, Meals on Wheels example, I might have the knowledge of where to get local services that I can get for help. An opportunity is something external to you. It might be, do those services that you need exist in your local community? So you need both capabilities and opportunities in life. And so we work with organizations to essentially what we come up with is a theory of change. We call it a social impact model, which is of how they go about doing achieving the impact that they are trying to have in the world, and then we help them to measure it. It's a scientific approach, so essentially this is the hypothesis, and then the measurement is testing that hypothesis. And so Meals on Wheels came to us and said, everybody knows that we provide food, we've got numbers around nutrition, that's easy, that data is all there. But what the story that we are not as strong in telling is the story of the impact that our thousands of volunteers and the thousands of social connections they're having with the people they deliver meals to across the country has on the well-being of everyone that's involved in that process. And so we set out to measure outcomes that related to that social connection and everything else that we felt was wrapped up in that. So we looked at clients and volunteers. So for clients, you can see up there belonging, connection, nourishment, a few other things, and similar for volunteers, but just with a couple of, there's a couple of differences there, specific things around leadership, enjoyment, and life skills as well. So let's get into the findings, which is the fun part. That's all the setup. So we'll start with volunteers. The first thing to note, essentially the way that we do the measurement is, in this case, is all survey based. So we surveyed thousands of Meals on Wheels volunteers across the country. We work with different services to do this. So yeah, volunteers and clients. And in terms of volunteers, the vast majority of Meals on Wheels volunteers are drivers or deliverers. That's the majority of the volunteer workforce, which makes sense when you think about the service. There are other people that work in the kitchens, coordinating activities, but that's the biggest group. Headline number for you here, we were able to show that Meals on Wheels have higher well-being than other Australians. So what this graph is, on the left, you've got that's a well-being average of people in Australia. So the scale is from 1 to 5. So average well-being in Australia is approximately 3.66. We had Meals on Wheels volunteers at 4.03, so quite a lot higher than an average Australian. But equally, in our database, we had data on other volunteer organisations as well, and we were also able to show that Meals on Wheels, in fact, had higher volunteers had higher well-being than people who were volunteering for other organisations as well, which might be a contentious thing to say in this room, but obviously Meals on Wheels were very happy to hear it. We also were able to show that volunteers of Meals on Wheels scored higher across a range of areas. Specifically, things around community connection were really higher. People, volunteers felt more part of a community. They felt more accepted by their community. They felt more confident they had a strong community around them. And equally, interestingly, they had more people in their life that were encouraging and praising them. Interestingly, we found that lower time commitment was actually associated with higher well-being, but just you can see from the numbers, we're talking 4.16 to 3.97, not a massive difference, but that was a trend that we saw. And equally, we saw slightly higher well-being amongst the drivers and deliverers. The theory there being that potentially some of the magic of Meals on Wheels is about that personal connection with your clients, but again, still very high scores amongst everyone else. We're going to skip past that one because we are low on time. And then I also wanted to share a couple of things about clients, even though this is the volunteering conference. In terms of Meals on Wheels clients, what we found were the vast majority of people are single, living on their own, and they have less than one social connection a day. So on average, they are on their less than one a day of seeing someone outside of their home, having a social connection with anyone else. And what we were also able to show through this measurement was what we found was that, in fact, for clients that had social connection, that had a better connection with their volunteer, that they had higher well-being. And so essentially, the work showed that the better you know your volunteer, the better off you are. So yeah, absolutely. We asked a question around how well people knew their volunteer. This is self-assessed from I know them very well, somewhat well, little bit to not at all. And you can see there that well-being is much higher amongst the clients that knew their volunteers well. So we were able to demonstrate the impact of that social connection, and also clients scored a lot higher in a whole range of areas. You get sent the slides afterwards. Scored higher in a whole range of areas, like feeling part of the community, feeling accepted by their community, their ability to share their thoughts and feelings with others in their life, their sense of purpose in life. So that stronger and meaningful connection with their volunteer was associated with high scores across a range of areas. So the so what of all this is obviously a key part of this is having a really powerful results to share with funders to demonstrate the important social connection element of the Meals on Wheels story. And equally, there were opportunities there to improve the service, finding out, okay, if you know your volunteer better, that has better outcomes for your clients. How can we better build opportunities for volunteers and clients to connect in a meaningful way? And so, yeah, that's a bit of a rush through those results, but thank you so much, and we'll hand back.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Kate. You notice at the pace as a facilitator and as presenters, we're flying through this because there's a lot to pack in. So bear with us, and online audience, stay in there because we have more to come from Dannika White, Director of Community Bee Collective.
Hi everyone. I haven't done it with the clicker yet, so bear with me. So, innovating for impact. So when I was thinking about this, why would someone innovate? Because we want to make something better. We want to do what we do more efficient, and we want to amplify our results. So for me, innovating usually involves this. How does that make everyone feel? I love it. I'm an agent of change, but I know that change makes people feel very uncomfortable. In fact, even positive change, whether you're moving house or moving a job or even a new relationship, it can be stressful. So that's not a problem. Everyone can feel that stress as long as you can move through it. When it becomes a problem is when it causes inertia. In fact, the fear of change is so prevalent, there is a phobia. Metathesiophobia. I learned that for this presentation. So pleased that came out well. I see a lot of this phobia in my line of work. Change is inevitable. Imagine back when Edison invented the light bulb, you had to move away from candles. I'm pretty sure there were some people who were resistant to that. The iPhone. This has changed how we take photos. It has changed how we interact with people. It's changed how we order cars, and it also has changed how we order food to our house. Apologies for anyone that might be from a regional area. With these changes, though, we have adapted to digital change. So, to me, innovation involves technology. And apologies, I have come from a very large IT firm, but now working in this sector. So we either keep doing what we're doing today, or we open ourselves up to using some technology to enable some innovation. Technology is happening all around us. I mean, we're seeing all those stories about the AI and facial recognition and creation of photos, etc. Even volunteering is entering into a collaborative phase. But it's never going to take away the face-to-face. Don't worry, we're always going to need the face-to-face interactions. But what it can do is take away the repetition. What it can do is bring in volunteers from somewhere else that you've never thought of before. So today I'm going to talk about digital progression in volunteering. So we're moving away from the spreadsheets, the post-it notes, or as one of my clients, post-it notes in the back of a diary. That's how they manage their volunteers, and towards technology that makes the job easier. You're taking out the repetition. It's a new way of working, a new way of engaging, and a new way of rewarding. Technology isn't scary, it's just unfamiliar. Ask my mum. My brothers and I were having a chat on WhatsApp. She wanted in so bad. And I said, Mum, okay, we'll download the WhatsApp. No, won't be doing any technology. Can't have that, can't have that. But what are you and your brothers talking about? So sent my brother over, loaded her up, WhatsApp. I'm thinking about turning the notifications off now. She loves it. Love you, Mum. Hope she doesn't see this recording. Okay. So change management. Let's talk about how to introduce change in a way that it is effective, it is impactful, and it sticks. So change management, there are countless models, and I'm talking with one of my co-panelists there. There are countless models and different steps and different ways of approaching this. And I've adopted a lot of those throughout my 20 years of implementing change in different organisations. But what I've tried to do is distill it down into 8 that I think resonates with some of my clients and in the line of work that I'm doing now. And I'll read those out in a moment. But what I want to say is no one method will suit everyone. You might pick and choose from this. Your programs might differ. And whilst I will be talking about technology, this also can ring true if you have a process change, any technology change, or even an organisational change. So I've made them 8. Articulate your vision, involve your stakeholders, develop a plan, communicate, iterate, celebrate progress, business as usual, and measure. So to make this a little bit more relatable, I'm going to talk about how we implemented some change with one of our clients, the Bendigo Volunteer Resource Centre. Now I'm told that maybe everyone won't understand what a volunteer resource centre is. They're all about creating participation within community and creating vibrant communities through volunteering. So they offer all sorts of services like connecting people to volunteering opportunities as well as training and enabling them. and matching them through to opportunities. The team at Bendigo Volunteer Resource Centre, which I'll henceforth refer to as BVRC, they're absolute rock stars and legends. So let's start with what was their vision. They wanted to position themselves as a central source of volunteering in central Victoria. The irony was they already were, but they wanted to move it to an online capability. Why? Because they wanted to make volunteering management easier for their volunteering involving organisations. They wanted to improve digital literacy because obviously one without the other isn't going to help, right? And they wanted to flip the value of volunteering, so create a sense of reciprocity. So just to, oh, the logo's back to the front, so it normally goes another way. That was a little slip of the PowerPoint. What we did there was we wanted to create a connective ecosystem between all the organisations within BVRC, create a shared ecosystem and an ability for them to share their data between them. So taking this through, I'm going to try and keep it in a fast pace. Stakeholders, you need to identify who in your organisation and outside your organisation will be impacted by this change. Identify them, figure out how you're going to harness their support, figure out how you're going to communicate with them and how you need to address each of them. For BVRC, it was their board, the CEO and their team on the internal. Externally, they needed to talk to everyone in the community, whether they be volunteers, potential volunteers, and then all the volunteer involving organisations, big and small. They also had a local champion to help them accelerate the change within the organisation and a few advocates that they cherry-picked from the community. Their plan, well, the plan was pretty easy. It was a standard implementation plan for us. So we implement a lot of change in introducing this platform into organisations. So what's your scope? What data do you have? Do you have any data? How do we need to upload it? And is it data from your organisation and or another organisation? And how do we cleanse that? How do we set up the platform to suit your needs, to suit your reporting and your hierarchical structure? For BVRC, it's pretty simple, but when you work across a nationwide charity, for instance, then you've got different states and different groups, etc. So there's a bit of mapping that goes on there. Training, again, are you going to adopt or train the trainer model? Will you be training your team only, or will you also be training the community as well? And then obviously the engagement with your community and your employees. Do you want to come on board? Do you see the value in this? And then obviously launch and then review. In terms of communication, communication is absolutely vital. You need to articulate very clearly why we're doing this. What's in it for me or what's in it for you? Why would you want to do this? You need to be regular, you need to be constant, but you also need to be very relevant. Don't just bombard them for the sake of it, make it really meaningful. And then the one thing else that I absolutely recommend is to keep a feedback model within your communication, because that's going to feed into your refine, iterate stage a little bit later. More than that, having a feedback model enables people to get a sense of ownership. I'm being heard. You heard me. Oh, you changed that. Oh, I did that. So all of a sudden, they're actually now starting to own your change as well. The BVRC, as part of the implementation, we provided them with a plethora of templates and messages and communication plans so that they could implement that. Obviously, if you have a communications team, they'll take that under guidance. They may not take it along. BVRC also deployed a multi-channel approach. So they basically went out to media. They leveraged newsletters, both their own and the local council. They also did a lot of face-to-face. They did IT labs. They annihilated poor old Bendigo. I think everybody knows about it. Refine and iterate. Doesn't matter how airtight or bulletproof your plan is, you are going to find speed humps. And hopefully they're little ones or ones you can drive around or ones you're just going to plow on through. So if you've got your feedback mechanism in your communications, you're going to identify them early and you can plan for them. And then you can adjust your plan accordingly. For BVRC, what we found was the digital literacy. We planned for that. We created some IT labs. We had to turn the notch up a little bit. So we also deployed a train the trainer. So that was something that we modified in our plan. And we also had to make that the technology easier for the volunteer managers. So we created a heap of different templates So they could just rinse and repeat. So they didn't have to do a whole lot of setup themselves. Now there was one more thing we planned for in 100 years. What was that? Oh, that's right. It was a pandemic. So again, we had to modify our plan, and that kind of accelerated us moving people online. So it was a double-edged sword. And then what are we up to? Stage 6, celebrate success. So we're not saying, hey, this is amazing. It's pick tiny little bits that make sense and celebrate them, because what you're trying to do is the change that we're making is actually starting to move. We're getting momentum, and build confidence that what you're doing is actually going to work. So definitely, you know, continue to celebrate your success. In terms of BVRC, they obviously celebrated training feedback, the first groups to join the platform, and starting to see people download social CVs, all that sort of stuff. So they cherry-picked things that were relevant to their program, and they celebrated it again through those communication channels that we mentioned before. Business as usual. This one's got to stick, doesn't matter what your change program is. If you don't bake your change and your new way of doing things into the levers that make up your business culture and the way your team do things, you're going to find your change backslides, or it's going to just evaporate. It was backslide, by the way. And yeah, so absolutely crucial that you build that into things such as your reward mechanisms. You might write it into someone's job role. You might add it into your reporting. It might be how you reward people. Think about what would be most meaningful for your team, employees, or community, and bake it in to make sure it sticks. BVRC had their local change champion, as I mentioned. That role wasn't permanent, so they had to plan as to how they make that business as usual. So they've trained up 2 people in their organisation, and I was telling someone in the break, someone in their 30s and someone in their 60s. So, you know, the stereotypical age differences don't mean a thing in Bendigo. They've also baked in the data that they get from the platform into their annual reporting, their communication to funders, as well as, you know, back to responding into government grants. And lastly, measurement. How did we do? Was it all worth it? Did we move the needle? You know, you really do actually need to take another look, because if you're going to do another change management program, you need to know what worked, what didn't work. So BVRC, did they move the needle? Were they the central point of volunteering? But did they move it online? Yes, they moved 60 organisations online within the first 6 months, which was absolutely terrific. COVID took a little bit of a dent on them growing that, but they're still working through that. Digital literacy, did they move that needle? Absolutely. The number of IT labs that they held, yes, they did. And that is an ongoing effort with the train the trainer. It will never be done. You know, with people come and go in a community, it's going to have to keep going. And then in terms of, did they make the volunteer role easier? Well, Helen definitely says, she said, yes, we did. You know, they've automated things like working with children checks. So you can pop that into the platform, you automatically get a reminder when that's coming to an end. So no more little nasty surprises. They've also, what do we have there? Oh, the volunteer waiver forms. We've, you know, popped a lot of stuff that they normally would have in 100 conversations. They're taking out a lot of that 100 conversations, and they've already got a lot of the information that they need when somebody signs up on the platform. And they're flipping the value in volunteering. Well, everything on our platform is about acquisition of skills. So that translates for the volunteers into pathways to education, pathways to employment, and they can spit out social CVs and so forth. So they felt that they moved forward. And then just lastly, what next? We'll be working with them to roll it out across an even larger swathe of regional Victoria in 2023.
Thank you for that, Dannika. Now, do we want to stand up for a big stretch? Because Penny is going to give you a wonderful, fascinating insight into change management with infused with some interesting new research, new insights.
No research, there will be no stats, there'll be no graphs, just in case, but maybe some new thoughts and concepts for you. So, I mean, this has been an incredibly rich couple of days, and we've heard from many organisational leaders in the plenary sessions who clearly embrace and understand the importance of volunteering. So it's a bit like, you know, we're preaching to our own choir, which has been fantastic. But I guess my presentation today is about, I want to speak to those who are struggling in their organisations, where there is perhaps a little less understanding and sponsorship for investing in volunteer involvement, despite in many cases your organisation's reliance on volunteers to achieve the mission. So that's what we're going to do today, guys. So strap in. It is quick, but there is a PowerPoint, which is, I didn't even think we were going to actually have a PowerPoint. I was thinking I'm going to be innovative by not having a PowerPoint, but because Emma and the team are so efficient, they got it there in anyway. So what I'm going to do is outline some key concepts that I identified and refined over many years. And the topic of the session is innovation for impact. Innovation, as we know, can be packaged as a new online system, which can solve a lot of our problems. But I would suggest that although I agree that tools are really critical, I would suggest that the key components that need to be in place for innovation to really flourish are these things, which is an organisational culture that is welcoming and inclusive volunteer involvement. That would be a good starter, hey? Managers and supervisors of volunteers have the capability and resources to plan, recruit and manage an unpaid workforce. And then, yes, tools. So if we're going to, is it this one? Oh, this one. Thanks. So there's your little triangle, fit for purpose. So cool, the culture just sits at the top. So it's really critical around having a culture that actually focuses on the value of volunteering. And then, yes, capability is really important and the tools to go with it. So I'm going to introduce 5 concepts which I've used to reframe an organisation's culture on the inclusion of volunteers. And we heard Sarah talk about legitimacy. So I'm going to start with legitimacy as a really critical piece for us as far as professionals in volunteer involvement. And I believe legitimacy starts with your own sense of your role and your personal authority. And then I'm going to connect with, that way, connecting with your organisation's primary task. I'll define what I mean by primary task, and identifying use of risk, opportunity, levers and hooks. We talked about levers a second ago. And reframing unhelpful narratives, and lastly, managing the proverbial setbacks that we get. So in some volunteering involving organisations, such as the 3 I've worked in, transforming stakeholders' mindset on the value of volunteer involvement has been a fundamental part to changing the organisation's culture to become more inclusive and creative in the ways that folk are engaged in mission. And that does start with your own sense of legitimacy. In your own role, your function and place in the organisation is really critical to making an impact. And creating legitimacy does require innovative thinking outside the business as usual, stepping back and considering the nature of the organisation's purpose and dynamics. And I've got a funny little story, which most of us know this, the story of David and Goliath, which really speaks to my experience in creating legitimacy in my role and personal authority. The story is a small boy, the youngest of 8 siblings. I'm the youngest child, so this really resonates for me, and of 4, not 8, who face into a 9-foot giant warrior to win the battle between 2 tribes. He faces into the giant, picks up a stone, and using a slingshot, successfully hits the giant in the temple, who falls over, and by doing so, David saves his tribe from being crushed. So my question is, for me, I'll ask it myself, but you can think about what you think, what's been in your years of being in volunteer involvement, what's affected your role and your personal authority to be able to step up to that plate. And so for me, my Goliaths have been, which will be different to yours, but for me, my Goliaths have been represented by who are my friends, the marketing and HR functions in the various organisations that I've worked in. They have always been more resourced and they have more influence and really in reality more legitimacy in comparison to the function that I've represented. The second Goliath I've had, different to you potentially, is I've been the disengaged, uninterested line managers that I've encountered in my 18 years in the sector. They just haven't understood. But I would suggest my biggest Goliath hasn't actually been those two things, although they have been. But my biggest challenge has been my giant fear and insecurity in finding my voice to speak up on the value and importance of volunteers at times. Not always, but at times. At times I struggled to exercise my voice to engage and challenge the dynamic of illegitimacy in a constructive way. So I'm here because my Goliath is less imposing. Otherwise I wouldn't be able to be here. So after so many years of being in the sector, my Goliath just got smaller and smaller and smaller. And doing the Masters in Organisation Dynamics has absolutely helped me be able to speak to you today. And I will be using some terms from that Masters in very simple terms because it took me a whole year to understand one article almost. It's quite dense, but really rich. So I think explaining legitimacy is best accomplished by describing illegitimacy, the experience of not being authorised, the feeling of being an alien amongst people who do not understand what it is you do and the value you bring. And that's why it's so great to be at these conferences and when we get to network, because you feel like you're not the other anymore. You feel quite with your people, with your folk. So since being in volunteer management, I've felt different to those who've worked in marketing or HR function. The term is an other or being othered, something that members of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities experience, our coal communities, our LGBTI communities often feel that othering. This othering was, for me personally, validated during a development session several years ago when a colleague selected a picture to illustrate how she experiences or perceived me. The image was a row of 7 pairs of sneakers, and they were all white except for one pair, which was red. And in her words, she represented that I was the red pair. In that one reflection, she both legitimised my experience and reinforced my difference. So what I'm going to say, and I know I'm spending a bit of time on this because I think it's really critical about how you see yourself, you know, your feet on the ground, how's your role authority is really important in venturing into this space of making impact. So I'd suggest our goal is not being the same as HR and marketing or whatever it is the function that you report into. I suggest that being legitimised, understood and valued and invested as holding a different role, the role to support the organisation mission is actually a really critical, important one. So how do you do this? How do you increase your role and functions legitimacy? So this is where we get to the primary task term. I'm not going to make it too complicated because it really isn't. It's the one thing that an organisation has to do to survive. So if you think about Macca's, what's the one thing they have to do to survive? They've got to sell hamburgers and fast food. That's what they have to do. For sporting clubs, and we've heard quite a bit about sporting clubs over the last couple of days, is that they have to provide the structure and frameworks for folk and children to play sport safely. Or someone who's supporting might actually tell me that that's wrong. That's just my impression, sorry, sporting folk. And homelessness services, what are they here to do? They're here to home homeless folks. So the best approach is first to identify, and I'm probably just not doing it. The first thing to do is identify what an organisation is set up to do, how it's organised, and identify how volunteer involvement serves that primary task and purpose, and how it fits or doesn't fit into the current structure. For the volunteer involvement sector, identifying the primary task and how the business is structured is key to understanding where and how volunteers and volunteer management fit. Knowing the role of volunteers to realise the organisation's primary task is a critical precursor to engage leadership in legitimising the volunteer management function and the role of volunteers in serving the mission. So if this was a workshop, which I'd love to do, this is what I'd get you to do. I'd actually get you to do, sorry, I'm just going to take us back, can't do it. Yeah, workshop, potential workshop, thanks guys. Potential workshop is I'd get you to write down what you believe your organisation's primary task is, and then I would get you to list your stakeholders and identify what their primary focus is and how it connects to the primary task. So understand their world, really, in relation to the mission. And then identify how volunteer involvement supports their focus. And then engage them in intentional conversation. So the next concept is identifying and using that knowledge and understanding the use of risk and opportunity levers. So my experience of writing many strategies that there are two approaches that connect with either the organisation as a whole or your individual stakeholder, their focus, to bring greater legitimacy and as a consequence, investment, what we want. And I don't mean just financial investment, I mean commitment, interest, engagement, the full gamut. So the two approaches have been risk and opportunity. So if you think about risk, we've heard a little bit about this, risk management or mitigation is a really useful strategy to gain relevance and investment. And it could be financial risk, it could be reputational risk, it could be safety. And sadly to say, it can be bolstered by things like the Royal Commissions. And there's been multiple Royal Commissions that have impacted this particular sector. And even government accreditation is really a great leverage too. So those things reduce, and ways in which to reduce the threat to the organisation's primary task, and link that to how volunteer processes reduce that risk. The second track is missional impact. So that's the opportunity piece. The involvement of volunteer increases the output of services and activities to support the organisation primary tasks. The argument of the first lever or hook is to invest in practices to decrease the risk, to the organisation's survival. And the second lever is to increase the involvement of volunteers to support the primary task, also to secure sustainability and survival. So both are really useful. And we'll do a bit of a quick poll. So in your organisations, I want you, for those who think each one of these resonate for you. So for those that think that actually risk is your best lever, put your hand up. Oh, very few. For those of you who think opportunity is your best lever, put your hand up. Okay, a few more. Lots of undecideds. Yep. There's no right answer here. It really is no right answer because it really does depend on the mindset of your leaders and folk within the organisation, your stakeholders. So for me, I've used both levers. In fact, in a strategy, I would actually put both in because you've got such a mixed audience potentially, depending on the size of your organisation. And I've found in one organisation that opportunity has been far more effective. In another organisation, if it wasn't for the Royal Commission, I'm not too sure how that would have gone. So it's been a really important lever. So it is actually understanding the nature of your organisation. So in developing those plans, it's really important to pull on those levers. And I love David Crosby's formula, change equals experience, what was it? Evidence and personal connection. He talked about that this morning. So it's using risk as an opportunity or risk or opportunity as an approach to bring about change. So the fourth concept is reframing how unhelpful narratives. And these are the narratives that run through our organisation. I don't know whether you've tabled those narratives. I've got a few smiling faces. Yep, I know those narratives. And they're really important to know because they actually demonstrate the unconscious biases that are evident in the culture of your organisation. So if you can uncover them, then you can tackle them. If you can't uncover them, you don't get to tackle. So it's really important to do that. So if I think about the three organisations I've had, and I'm not going to go through the whole list because we don't have time, but things like volunteers are unreliable. We heard today only old people volunteer. We heard that Indigenous folk don't volunteer, perceptions. I'm not saying this is true, this is the perceptions. So it's really uncovering those particular narratives. I mean, for instance, in RSPCA, the narrative was that people don't want to work in the back of house, they only want to work with animals. That's curious, isn't it? And the last concept is managing setbacks, which is really important. And this is where we're one of the system psychodynamic concepts of actually creating space for emotion and thought is really important. So allowing the space for your teams to come together when they're being hit by setbacks, to actually allow that time to talk about what that impact of that setback has been. So actually allow it, have the conversation, get in there, feel the emotion, express the emotion, have the time, because by doing that, that actually clears the space for something new to be created. It's worked time and time again. So do that. So there are your 5 concepts. You've got the PowerPoint, which I haven't done a great job. I'm going to leave you a quick poem, which has been the thing that survived me over 17 years. Is God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thank you.
Thank you for Penny for that moment of reflection, and it's a great poem to finish the panelist session. So what I've learned from the first 2 speakers, Simon and Kate, was to pay attention to the different impacts. So we immediately think of meals as nourishment for the body, but we learned that the Meals on Wheels program is nourishment for well-being for the clients and volunteers. So innovation for impact, we zeroed in on the why measure impacts and have a broad mind about impact. For the last 2 speakers, I learned about the lens of instigating, agitating, pulling levers for innovation and change. And once you get that win to implement the innovation, actually carry out the change process to materialize and embed the innovation and not backslide. So that's my reflection, and I want to throw that to the floor for Q&A. We're very lucky today to have walkers around with microphones, and so that way the online audience can also hear your questions. And we'll ask the panelists to also stand up so that you can see them when they answer the question. So I'll throw it to the floor. If you can just introduce your name, where you're from, that would be wonderful too.
I'll introduce my name. My name is Christine and I'm at Red Cross. To Hoover and Meals on Wheels, one thing about, I suppose, doing the measurement, is there a process where you're doing it in an ongoing way? And also working with, I suppose, the network of people that may not be able to capture their information really easily through digital means or whatever. So how did you resource that and be able to sort of do that?
The ongoing evolvement of the research has been critical. So right now we're taking the research that we did initially and we're expanding it through a whole range of New South Wales services and taking it another layer down to really understand some of the nuances of that connectivity. One of the joyful things about connecting people who don't have a lot of tech is that we deliver a meal. So sticking a form with a meal and getting it out to community was relatively easy compared to some other organisations. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that actually Meals on Wheels are amazing at getting stuff to people and getting forms back. It's actually really rare. The hardest part in our job, working with any organisation we work with, is actually how to collect data. We primarily work through surveys. Lots of organisations are great at doing whatever they do. They're not necessarily great at getting people to fill out surveys for them. And I think we can all agree, as everyone in this room, that we are a survey-saturated society now. That you buy a tomato at the fruit shop and they want you rate their experience. So it is getting harder and harder to get that kind of data. And so, but thankfully, Meals on Wheels. Normally, I'm like. It's really embarrassing, some of the conversations I have. They have to be very details focused. It's kind of like, okay, so the form, when they hand it to the person, how are they going, is that in an envelope, all that detail. Whereas all the Meals on Wheels services are like, literally, our job is delivering things to our clients. And so there was a bit of more conversation around how we were going to engage volunteers that didn't, because essentially for clients, we did only paper. And then for volunteers, it was online first and then with a paper option. And so there was some more conversations there around how to make sure that the volunteers who didn't want to respond to an email or didn't have email addresses could get access. And so, but yeah, for the clients, it was actually surprisingly straightforward. Yeah, one of the services was schooling me the other day. They're like, we have to give these people all sorts of things. We give, there's things that sponsors that offer, and there's all sorts of things that are getting delivered on a regular basis. So that process was relatively straightforward. The harder thing is maybe around making sure having some good communications in place. So if you do have clients that say have a carer or need extra support, making sure that there's enough context in what they're getting, so that if they hand it to their carer, the carer can actually take them through it in a way that will be helpful and meaningful. Rather than filling out in a way that will change the responses and that sort of thing. So that's actually the harder part of it is around specific demographics within that need that extra support, and when you're doing it at scale, it can be harder to get those comms out there to the people that need that support. So I'd say that's where the greater challenge is, and then that's around. But yeah, again, Meals on Wheels services know their people very well, and so they know who's going to need that support. They know who they need to speak to, and it's about making sure the teams have the information they need to be able to have those conversations.
Hey, I just wanted to ask what's the best ways to actually reframe those narratives and get them out there, because obviously just saying it once isn't necessarily going to change things. So how do you kind of get people on board with a changed narrative?
Yeah, happy to answer that question. It really is, I think, David did say that, change equals the EP, yep. And it's that mixture of data and also storytelling. So we've heard a little bit about that this last couple of days. So if you don't have data, that's really problematic, and I know what that's like. So I've actually drawn on data from the sector. In the early days where I didn't have data from the organisations in which I worked, I just drew it from sector. I rang colleagues at different organisations, can I have your data? Or I just drew it from Volunteering Australia or the peak bodies. So use that to start with, but if you do have organisational data, that is really powerful. And the storytelling. So you're pulling on their brains, so the logic, and you're getting them in the heart. So if you can do that, it's really good. And the other thing is in getting those stories out into your organisation. So if there's newsletters, there's various different platforms that you can use as pushing those stories, particularly stories that challenge the myths. If you can tackle those myths, you can start to change the narrative. And so you get to control that. And it is hardest thing to take the time. So that's that really sense of what's the organisation's primary purpose. I'm going to find those myths, and if those myths are actually challenging the primary the purpose of the organisation, you've got great legitimacy to cut in there.
Thanks, Penny. I think I saw a third hand before.
Penny, I have to ask you a question, even though we work together, because I think it's really interesting what you put out there, and I know how smart you are. On a legitimacy on an individual level, how do you influence it on an individual level? Because you talked about it at a cultural level, but some of us tackle things just on an individual CEO, one leader on a board that you need to drive a decision and change with.
So the question is,
so
as in me as an individual, or you as an individual?
Yeah, I think thinking at an individual level, because I know you talked about the role you have in the family, fourth born, and I know it's really interesting. I gave
Jane a bit of a crash course on system psychodynamics the other night.
So interesting, I have to tell you, the role you play in your family.
There is two kind of authorities. You've got your role authority, and you can kind of gain a sense of your role authority from your PD. So what are you asked to do is your role authority. Now, it depends on whether the organisation's actually authorised that role or not. So you've got the PD, but have they really intentionally meant you to do that thing that they've asked you to do? And that's a little complicated. We all know that's a bit complicated. And then those who you work with, are they actually authorising you in that role? So that's your work role. And then that's the other thing is your Goliath. What's your Goliath? So that's your personal authority. What's affecting your sense of personal effect? And it's good to look at those two things. The one that's hardest to change is the one that's in here. So it's hard enough in the dynamic, of course, of work, but it is hard, and it is a good opportunity just to kind of think about your personal authority and how you're bringing that into your role. Because I do think as a sector, we can change the narrative in Australia if we take up both our personal and our role authority. Australia will look different.
Thank you, Penny. I'd like to add to that, Penny. So in terms of claiming our authority and your, I guess, agitation for the sector to claim our authority, when I was running the Volunteer Managers Network for Volunteer West, one of the challenges which I shared with Dannika and Penny is that lots of volunteer managers or volunteer leaders feel that volunteering management is still not enough of a strategic priority in their organisation. And so sometimes at a loss, and I think sometimes you have to be bold, which is just to claim the authority. And that was something that we tried, and as part of the sort of, I guess, the uplift for the Volunteer West, we made audacity one of our goals, and just to claim the authority. And it followed. That was a good experiment and a powerful learning lesson for me. Yeah. So you had a comment, Simon.
No, I was just going to make a joke that we all talk so that we all talk so fast we covered off everything, and so that's why no one has questions. So.
Oh no, Simon, got more in the middle there.
Hi, my name's Kirsten. I work for Teach, Learn, Grow in WA, and you were talking about saturation-heavy society. And in our organisation, we are very lucky that we use feedback in everything. So we've got a lot of data on the uni students we work with and how they are impacted, as well as the school students we work with and how our volunteering impacts them. The problem is every time we have a training day, we kind of bombard them with surveys. We ask, you know, like pre-primary school students to fill out a little survey. And there's a lot of questions about like how effective our data collection is. And I was just wondering if you had any tips on how we can more effectively collect data without necessarily using too many surveys.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right, and that is a real challenge, and I don't think it's a unique challenge. Something that we are getting better at all the time at my organisation, and that is really around being really critical of the surveys that we're creating, and really like looking at every single question we're asking, but not even just every question, every part of the survey. So obviously for ethics, we've got to have this introduction so that people can understand, so they can give informed consent. We've got to explain why they're doing the survey, what it exists for. But are we doing that in a standard, we use the same introduction for every survey, and so it's a longer paragraph than it needs to be? Or have we actually cut it, pared it right back to the core message that it is, so that, say, a primary schooler can get what they need to get and then move on to the questions? Is a question there because someone in a thought bubble session said, oh, maybe we should ask them about this? Or is that question there because it's tied back to a metric that you 100% need to be measuring, and your funders are going to want to ask about, your executive's going to want to ask about? So it's really, I think, just interrogating every aspect of the process and just trying to get everything as lean as possible. And yeah, and I mean, if I wouldn't pretend that we get that right every single time, but it's becoming more and more important, I think. And we're actually, you're always trying to strike a balance, because obviously the more data you get, the more you can do with it. But equally, the more you ask, the less you're going to get overall. So it's just about striking that balance and thinking about what the audience for that data collection that you're doing. So obviously with primary schoolers, the attention span is a lot shorter. And so you want to make sure that you've really pared that right back. Maybe if it is a really active, engaged audience, actually, thankfully with Meals on Wheels, older Australians are more happy to fill out surveys and happy with a bit more length in their survey. So we're comfortably able to collect a bit more data and had really high response rates. But you know, that's not the case. Like, we do a lot of work with youth at risk organisations where getting the young person to sit down at all is already a challenge, let alone answering 60 questions. So yeah, so it's really just about making sure that you've interrogated every single element of the process and that it's all fit for purpose.
I have Kate.
I was just going to say, I wonder, as a sector, we're all starting, you know, this massive social impact measurement conversation. We know we have to do it, and we know we have to get better at it. But what we don't do well enough, and I think Simon's just beautifully outlined this, is we don't actually interrogate the questions well enough. So we're so almost desperate to get information because we need it for our funders, we need it for our boards, we need it for our organisations, that we probably don't spend enough time thinking about, well, what are we going to do with that data once we collect it? Because if it's just going to sit in a database, well, why are we even worrying about collecting that? So I'd rather us collect less and be more powerful. You know, use our data in a way that really cuts through, rather than having a truckload of data. So I'm just saying that as a member of the sector, you know, it's a bit like, you know, your beautiful example about you go and buy something and 2 seconds later you get a feedback form. It drives me spare. We need to be really, really crisp at our questions, which is, what are we going to do with it? And that's just my little musing, but maybe that's something that you think about as well.
And just a quick example on the back of that, I think demographic data is a really key one there. You know, a lot of people just put a range of standard questions, gender, housing arrangement, might chuck sexuality in there. Are you going to do anything with that demographic data? Do you need to know it for your service, or are you just collecting it because the form has always collected that? But you know, I think sometimes that stuff happens by rote, but you can actually be really clear about, okay, the sexuality of the people doesn't matter to us. That might be interesting, but we actually don't need to know that. And so let's cut that question out.
Thanks. I just want to add to what's just been said and agree with what's been said. When that previous question was asked, and the first comment was that we have a lot of data, we have so much data, and I had alarm bells flagging, because why do you have so much data and what are you doing with it? And then to now where we're being asked to rate a tomato, it's a breach of, and especially with so many breaches of privacy at the moment with hacking and all the rest. I mean, this is obviously something different, but population in general is getting very suspicious of anyone holding personal data. And just to follow on from why you're asking about sexuality or gender or age or whatever, if it's not really needed, I'll just add in that it's not actually legal to ask if someone's disabled or not unless you do have a genuine reason for needing to know. And if you do, please ask it in a way that doesn't say, are you disabled? It's more appropriate to say, is there anything we can do to assist in making our volunteer role more beneficial for both of us, and that sort of thing. So I'm just flagging that. Thank you. And thank you for bringing it to everyone's attention.
Thank you for that. We have another question here.
Hi, my name's Alison. I work in emergency management, so looking after emergency response volunteers. So my question is, our organisation is so focused on preparing and responding to emergencies, so putting out fires, you know, taking trees off of roofs and things like that, that we spend very little time, measuring social impact. The question is, where do we start? Where's the starting point for organisations that just haven't even dipped a toe in this pond yet?
I'm going to throw that question to Dannika, if that's okay, because because you work with Bendigo out in the regions and rural, so.
A bit different to emergency management though.
But they do, I imagine they do volunteer VIOs, emergency services there. Yeah.
If you've got data, that's a starting point, and have a look at what you've got, and then from there have a look at what. But with our customers, we always start with what matters to your fund, what matters to the people you want to attract into your programs, and then obviously what do you want to, your impact. So you guys, it's not just your volunteers, it's not just the hours or the properties, the lives saved. So they're pretty, that's to start with, but it's also, all the other impacts. Yeah, that doesn't,
Meals and Wheels is also an essential service. We've had continual delivery through every fire, bushfire, all the recent floods. One of my beautiful stories, I have to tell you one, is in Lismore. This 85-year-old volunteer walked around the floods in Lismore. Imagine that, to make sure that his 90-year-old client was getting the meal, they were okay, did the wellbeing check, I think he walked for about half an hour to get there and then back again. So I think the thing, it's rudimentary. A lot of the Meals and Wheels team just write things on pieces of paper and pop them in their pocket, and then we collate them later. It's not perfect, but we often have just one or two things that matter. And don't try and do it too big, which was back to my point again about what do you want to measure and why. But I know exactly what you're saying, and I can hear that, and it's so important that you do, and maybe have that conversation with your team about, well, what would we measure? If there was just 3 things, what would they be? And why would we measure them? And how can that help us do what we do? Because what you do is so important, but it's also equally important to be able to share how fabulous you are.
Get external views on what you do, because you guys can't see the fabulousness, and ask externals. So, the people that you might want to report up to, the government, Volunteering Victoria, whoever, ask their opinion, because they're going to see something completely different to your own.
So I think a really key point, kind of coming back to everything that's been said, is to really start with the why of, okay, why do we actually want to measure? Like, so is there a funding necessity that is saying, you know, our funders are starting to ask these questions, we don't have answers? Is it that we want our members to better understand the broader impact that we're having so that we can keep that inspiration going? That's often something people say to us. They're like, the work we do is hard. We need to remind people that it actually is good because day to day, sometimes it can feel really, you can just see the difficulty rather than the change. And just get really clear on, okay, why do we want to do this? And so then, and kind of work backwards from there. So, okay, why do we want to do this? What would we, to meet that need that we've got there in our why, what are the things that we'd ideally like to have? And, you know, how do we go about gathering those things and working backwards from that? And generally what you'll end up doing is some balance between what your perfect ideal would be, you know, which would be like sitting down Meals on Wheels clients, asking them 1,000 questions about all the different things that are going on in their life and everything, you know, and pairing it back to what's practical, which might end up being a 40-question survey. But, you know, there'll be something in there that you can kind of land on. So.
Thank you for that. We're running, oh, well, Gemma's kindly given us one last more question. So we got one in the middle there with the lady in the middle there. Oh, you can come up and ask presenters later.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask one last question. A quick comment. I want to give a pitch for the research network run by Volunteering Australia. They met this morning. They're looking at how they can set up model questions, which might help people to ask questions to add to a database infrastructure that they're going to be. So you'll be able to benchmark. Very exciting. And I had a question about the sustainable development over the last couple of days and the extent to which people on the panel or in the audience might already be using that as a framework for measurement. I think it's quite hard because they're national indicators, and I'm interested in working with other people about how to bring that local level.
I'm going to have to ask the speakers to go through very short and sharp because we've got a minute left. Yeah.
So I find we see more corporates wanting to report on the sustainability goals more so than you know, than grassroots and other. But it's gaining pace. But our offices in the UK, it's a higher instance of need and requirement to report on that. So it depends.
I'm certainly not aware. The Salvation Army would be reporting on it from a social program research perspective, but not around volunteering. It was interesting to hear this morning from our UN friend that they're only looking at connecting that in, it seemed, recently. So I don't know whether you picked that up. It was a question that I had. Is this only just, it sounded like it's a new piece of work. So yeah, it's certainly not. But when I was at World Vision, it was very front and centre.
And
Yeah.
Simon, you got the last.
Just in connecting into the SDGs. There's good and bad things about SDGs in terms of a lot of them are pretty output focused, and so it's more about numbers of what you're doing. Can still be really useful, but I think, yeah, it's just bringing it back to whether you think there's going to be value in your organisation in connecting into that broader structure.
Thank you. I guess what we've heard, and it feels like, because we flew through it so fast and compacted, that it's a sort of David and Goliath. But remember, David knocked Goliath with one little pebble. So it can happen. So I'll bring that to a close, and I want to say thank you to our speakers, Simon, Kate, Dannika, and Penny.